Good morning and welcome to the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear. My name is Marla Barthen. I'm the co-president, and today's offering will be The Truth About Critical Race Theory with our special guest, Kimberly J. Cook, professor over at UNCW, Department of Sociology and Criminology. She's also the director of the Restorative Justice Collaborative. So welcome to her and welcome to all of you. I just wanted to give you a little housekeeping about the League of Women Voters so that you know what kind of organization we are and what we're about. The League is a nonpartisan organization, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties. We are committed fully to diversity, equity, and inclusion in principle and in practice. We do have our policies listed on our website. If you would like to visit those and check those out, it's at lwvlcf.org. We also recognize the tribal lands of the Waccamaw, Siouan, and Indigenous people of the Lower Cape Fear. So let me tell you a little bit about Kimberly. Dr. Kimberly Cook, oops, okay, sir, moving all over my screen. Let me move you out of the way. Dr. Kimberly Cook is a professor of sociology and criminology at UNCW. She earned her doctorate in sociology from the University of New Hampshire in 1994. In 2001, Dr. Cook traveled to Australia and New Zealand as a Fulbright senior scholar to study restorative justice divisionary programs. She has published research articles about restorative justice, wrongful convictions, shelter services for battered women, and feminist criminology. In 2004, Dr. Cook was trained in restorative practices by Kay Pranis and became a facilitator in Maine. In 2011, Dr. Cook served as assistant chair of the Conference Committee for the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice Biennial Conference in Raleigh, North Carolina. Since 2015, Dr. Cook resumed working as a restorative justice facilitator in New Hanover County, including the juvenile court, public schools, and local nonprofit organizations. She has helped to organize and facilitate restorative justice training for New Hanover County schools and has helped to build capacity in many schools throughout the district. Dr. Cook is especially interested in using restorative practices to promote racial and gendered justice. She chairs the board of directors for LINK, Inc., a prisoner reentry residential service, and is a founding board member for Healing Justice, offering restorative justice-based peer support and policy reform for people directly impacted by wrongful convictions. Today, she'll be talking with us about the truth about critical race theory, which has become a very magnified topic in recent months. And so she's done a wonderful interview on WHQR, and we were very blessed to have her come today and explain more about critical race theory so that we have a deeper understanding of what's happening. So thank you and welcome to Kim.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And I'd like to share my screen as well, because I do have a few slides that will help us to get started. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about critical race theory, which has been a theoretical framework for scholars in sociology and criminology, legal studies, psychology, political science, public affairs for about 40 years now. It's not new and it's not sexy or trendy. It just happens to be the issue that seems to be gaining a lot of attention these days. I do want to share with you a little bit about my individual utility of critical race theory. I've been using it in my research for since 1999, when I first published these articles in various formats. I started using critical race theory to examine shelter services for battered women in the Deep South, and for my research on the convergence between public opinions and policy on abortion and the death penalty. I've also used critical race theory in my research in feminist criminology and in restorative justice practices. And these are just some of the title pages of a few of my publications, just to give you a sense of where I've been spending my time in terms of critical race theory. So I'm here today at the invitation of the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fear, and I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about the emergence of critical race theory, what it really is, and what it's meant to provide as an analytical framework for exploring how we do what we do. It emerged in the 1980s, largely due to the legal scholars Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and many others. There have been quite a lot of manifestations of critical race theory throughout academic research. It is a very popular topic in law schools, as well as in sociology of law classes at the university level and in many other social science traditions in particular. It started out in legal studies, and I have the word critical there highlighted in red because critical has a specific meaning. When we call something critical legal studies or critical race theory, the critical is a denotation of a specific type of perspective. And the perspective is we are looking at the power dynamics of how social inequality is shaped and who shapes it and for what gain are they shaping it. And so it's about looking at the production of social inequality in the field in which is being referred to as critical. So whether it's critical criminology or critical feminist theory or critical race theory or critical legal studies, it's really about an obligation of the scholar to explore how power is utilized in that field. We also acknowledge in critical studies that opportunities across society are not evenly distributed, right? And so not everyone has the same access to the resources that they need for a meaningful education. Not everybody has access to the same resources for economic security, right? So critical legal studies is about looking at how these conditions are reproduced through policies and practices. Critical race theory has a variety of different components to it. And one of the components is that race is a social construct. And what that means, race being a social construct, is that while we have some pigmentation differences that are biologically and genetically inherited in our skin tone, the social construct around race and racism is that the meaning that we make of those differences in terms of the genetic transfer and the genetic conditions of skin tone. And so race is a social construct, meaning that we make meaning of those differences among us. And oftentimes that meaning, historically, that meaning has been that people with a certain skin tone that looks a lot more like mine have certain advantages and certain entitlements, if you will, to access the resources that make for a quality of life. Another tenet of critical race theory is that race, gender, and economic class intersect to reinforce the power and control that goes along with the different types of advantages that we often try to track and trace and figure out the root causes. We also look at the inclusion and exclusion practices in critical race theory that are systematic. So we often look at rules and policies and procedures and application and criteria and all of the ways in which people are either included because they meet the expectations of applications and criteria, or excluded because they don't. And who sets those inclusion requirements and policies and practices, and why are they setting those policies and practices in that way? We also talk about, in critical race theory, we often talk about counter narratives, which is a resistance to the racialized exclusion features, which usually features voices and experiences from the perspective of the disenfranchised and the marginalized. So the people who are historically excluded are usually central to the arena of concern for critical race scholars. And so we're looking to try and bring the voices of people who have been marginalized more into the conversation and more into the arena of concern, so that when we advocate for reform, we're doing so with their voices and their experiences as part of the conversation. Critical race theory really is a search for the root causes of the current predicament that we find ourselves in terms of racial inequality and gender inequality, sexual orientation, and economic inequality. We look for the historical patterns, we look for legislation, we look for policies and practices. We also look for current and contemporary elements of legislation, policies, and practices as it relates to and either reinforces or combats historical patterns. And we're doing so in a political environment that is increasingly factionalized. And we know that as we continue to work on critical race theory or trying to achieve more racial justice, we are doing so in a political environment that is very charged right now and has been for quite some time. So commonly used concepts in critical race theory, which often are the tools that we use to explain what we mean when we're talking about various elements of social inequality, whether it's based on race or gender or class, are the following things. And the goal of highlighting these concepts is to, as outlined in the book Critical Race Theory, is to move us towards an ethical commitment to human liberation and to make the unseen more visible. Oftentimes it's hard to explain how racial inequality and racial injustice exists if you've never experienced it. And typically for people who consider ourselves white or who have been designated white in our social construct around race, we often don't see the type of struggles that that other people who, particularly who are designated as people of color, which actually is people of the global majority, don't have the types of security and safety, and we typically don't see those struggles. So we often talk about the social construct of race, which I've already covered. You might hear a lot of talk about microaggressions, and microaggressions are the many ways and infinite ways in which people of color often experience those of us who are considered white as engaging in subtle hostility toward them. So for example, I was giving a talk one time about racial bias in the application of capital punishment and a woman in the, and wrongful convictions, and a woman in the audience asked a question about feeling a sense of discrimination when she, as a grocery store clerk, and she is an African-American woman, had been treated badly by a customer who was coming through her checkout line. And the way in which she was treated badly kind of culminated in the fact that the white woman who was in the checkout line refused to touch her hand when receiving the change. And that kind of microaggression is symbolic of hundreds of years of white supremacist dogma, which indicates that people of color are somehow contaminated. And so we need to look at these microaggressions. There's so many of them that it's important for us to name it in order to change it, in order to make it visible. We also talk about white privilege, and the original concept of white privilege is now being reshaped to think more about white advantages. So the advantages that people who look like me have because of the color of our skin. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I want to show you some ideas around how white privilege shapes our lives. And so white privilege is another concept in critical race theory. I've already mentioned systemic racism, which is about policies and procedures and practices and historical legacies that maintain privileges based on race. We also talk about the intersection between race, class, and gender, that as a white person, I have some advantages, but as a woman, I also have some challenges, right? And so those intersections of class and race configure how I experience the world and how we all experience the world. And so to use a lens of intersectionality helps us to identify and see, to make the nuances of our lived experiences more visible to us and to others. We often talk about implicit bias, right? That we have implicit associations, implicit bias that we live with, and they're often the knee-jerk reaction because they live deep in our amygdala, deep in our brainstem. These implicit biases that are sometimes a knee-jerk reaction to people around us and to ideas and to conditions in our community that sometimes factor into how we behave without us really thinking through how we're behaving. Many of us in Wilmington and in New Hanover County have been able to participate in the groundwater training from the Racial Equity Institute, wherein we learn about the fact that these types of inequalities and these types of conditions are in the groundwater of society. They're built into the structure. They seep through every part of our society, and they are not going to be going away anytime soon. In critical race theory, we also spend a fair amount of time documenting the empirical evidence. So the data, what do the data show about racial inequality? Because it is everywhere. And so here's a quick chart that I pulled from the Bureau of Prisons, the Federal Bureau of Prisons yesterday, which demonstrates that for the percentage of inmates who are Black in the Federal Bureau of Prison is 38.2%, which is massively disproportionate to their representation in the population. We also see in housing, home ownership over time from the Housing Vacancy Survey from the US Census Bureau, which was published a year ago in March, that approximately 70% of white, non-Hispanic whites are consistently owning their own home, whereas only consistently under 50%, closer to low 40% of African Americans are owning their own homes. So that kind of an inequality in housing is indicative of, these two examples are indicative of a broader array of the types of inequalities that we often measure. We think about health disparities, and we've seen those statistics. We think about the achievement gap in education, and we've seen those statistics. We also see a variety of different types of empirical evidence of inequality with respect to the school to prison pipeline as a consequence of zero tolerance discipline policies that have been part of our educational structures for decades now. We see a historical legacy toward redlining in the housing market, which sets up inequality within residential neighborhoods. Here in New Hanover County, we have had a pretty heated debate regarding neighborhood schools, which has been well documented as recreating segregation in our schools, particularly since the 2010 changes that took place. And of course, we're also seeing voting rights restrictions and lower voter participation rates as a consequence of that. And so all of this empirical evidence is available to anyone who wants to see it. It's out there. It is available from reliable sources. So we're not using, like you will see that I use the Bureau of Prisons and the US Census Bureau. Those are dependable sources of data. So make sure that the data that you use is data that is dependable. So here's a pop quiz. And this has to do with making the concept of white privilege a little bit more visible, which we could do this with other ones, but we wouldn't have the entire day to do that. So here's a pop quiz. You should have a piece of paper and a pen handy because you'll be answering some quick questions. So the quiz I drew, it's called a white privilege scale that I made from Peggy McIntosh's famous article from 1988 about white privilege. So I want you to answer these 5 questions that I'll put on the screen and read out to you with a digit. 0 means it's never true. 1 means it's rarely true. 2 means it's usually true. And 3 means it's always true. So you're not going to be asked to share your share your scores at the end, but I just want to have, and you'll be invited to if you want to, I just want to have a framework for all of us to sort of think through our own white privilege or experiences of white privilege for those of us who are among us that are people of color. So answer if this is 0, never true, 1, rarely true, 2, usually true, or 3, always true. When I was taught about American history, I frequently saw people of my own race portrayed in a positive light. Score your experiences. You don't have to spend a lot of time thinking this through. Just go ahead and write down your first response there. Number 2, I can turn on the TV and easily find people of my own race being portrayed in a positive light. Number 3, I can easily buy greeting cards, cosmetics, toys, and children's books that reflect people of my own race without having to search very far. Number 4, I can enjoy cultural traditions in American society without having to become familiar with other cultures. And finally, number 5, I am never asked to speak for all people of my own racial group. Now add up your numbers. And if your score is from a 0 to 5, you have not inherited much white privilege. If your score is 6 to 10, you have inherited some white privilege. If your score is 11 to 15, you have been steeped in white privilege for years. And for the record, my score is a 15. So hopefully that gives you some sort of an orientation in terms of your own relationship to racial inequality in our society. We know from a critical race theory perspective that it is persistent racial inequality that is historical and deliberate. The economic foundations of the practice of enslavement and genocide are real and have continued to impact our society in many ways. And here you will see an image of a sketch of a ship of enslaved people from Africa. And you will also see a sketch of King Philip, who was also known as Metacomet, who was one of the indigenous elders in Massachusetts Bay during the time of the early settlements in Massachusetts. He was murdered in 1676 at the end of King Philip's War. And you will also see an image of the white government union pin, which was used in Wilmington and part of our experience with the 1898 massacre and coup. It is persistent, it is historical, and it is deliberate. Deliberate meaning people planned it, right? People made policies and practices around constructing and maintaining racial inequality. And this is what critical race theory provides us. Here in Wilmington, we've also seen the devastating impact of the greatest school under the sun being closed. We have also seen, as I mentioned before, the 2010 debates regarding neighborhood schools, and that debate continues, which creates for us a racially unequal legacy in our city, in our county, in our state, and in our country. Racial justice, racial inequality is a foundation stone of how this country was started. There have been scholars who have referred to it as America's original sin. So this is not anything new, and it is, from a critical race theory perspective, it is the truth of our nation's history. We also know that at the individual level and at the social level, there are traumatic impacts of this type of inequality. So we might perceive our own personal struggles as only personal struggles, but our personal struggles are impacted by and consistent with also the struggles that go on in our families, the opportunities that we have in our education system, the economic barriers that keep us, some of us, locked out of economic opportunity and economic success. And then there's political barriers to our participation in the civic life of our communities and in our state and in our nation. So the traumatic impacts of this type of racial inequality are real. The cumulative impact of daily microaggressions alone are extraordinarily painful and difficult. It increases stress level. It increases the type of sense of alienation that many people who are targeted by this type of inequality often experience. I don't want to neglect also that to continue to strive toward full participation in civic life for people who are targeted by this type of inequality, persistent historical inequality, the persistence to participate is really an act of amazing resilience and strength and determination and gumption. And so I think it's important for us to acknowledge that. Sean Ginwright, who is a scholar of education in particular, refers to this type of traumatic impact, instead of calling it PTSD, because it's not post-traumatic, it's persistent traumatic stress environments that we have to take seriously. So critical race scholars are trying to document what the conditions are in order to improve the conditions and create a dialogue around how we can do better, because we do need to do better. So where do we go from here? First of all, some truths about critical race theory is that it is data-driven, it is relevant to an honest depiction of our history, and it is a contemporary case for racial justice to be a goal for today, for now, and for our future. It is trying to identify the root causes, and it aims to provide a path toward racial justice. It is focused on changing systems, those rules, the legislation, the policies, the practices, the criteria, the applications, because when you work toward including people, you're also working toward excluding people. So it is a useful analytical tool. It provides the voices of marginalized people as a platform for understanding and deepening empathy and deepening community around the voices and the experiences of people who have been the targets of this type of inequality. The current controversy is, as I read it as a sociologist, is an emerging political strategy to engage the base of those who are trying to support the status quo of the racial inequality that we're seeing. But we know that strategy can often stray pretty far from the facts when we are trying to engage in a serious and nuanced conversation about the conditions in our world. And so I just want us to all be aware that the political strategy that we're seeing unfold now with respect to the opposition to critical race theory is meant to reframe critical race theory into something that it is never intended to be, or it has never intended to be. So we know that there's factionalism. Supporters and advocates for racial justice, and I would count myself as one of them, is we are trying to combat the status quo of the racial inequality. We're trying to, of course, advance a more accurate historical narrative, which is more complete and more nuanced than what I've been able to portray in this short presentation. We're trying to depend on accurate empirical evidence regarding the various forms of inequalities and locations where inequalities are visible and seen and documented. Our values that drive those of us who use critical race theory is a value toward equity and inclusion because it is fair and it is just to do so. Opponents of critical race theory, and this is broadly defined, are, as I see it, are trying to combat the ideas that drive the racial justice campaigns. There is a goal to maintain the status quo as it is, as far as I can tell. And a historical narrative that matters is a historical narrative around patriotic education, which we've seen as part of this conversation. So we can have that conversation for those of you that have some questions around that. Some local resources and initiatives that might be helpful. The New Hanover County Resiliency Task Force is working on diversity, equity, and inclusion, among many other things. Link Incorporated, which is a prisoner reentry program, is looking at and is actively engaged in efforts to combat racism in our community. We have the NAACP, we have the Black Leadership Caucus. We're very fortunate in this area also to have Genesis Block working at developing minority-owned businesses and entrepreneurial enterprises, which has had tremendous success. We also have the initiatives of the African American Historical Commissions, both at the city and the county level. We have the 1898 Observance Committee. We have the New Hanover County Community Remembrance Project. We're doing a soil collection to commemorate the lives of the people who were murdered in the 1898 massacre and coup. That soil collection ceremony will occur on November 6th. We're also thankful for the special effort and expertise of Tim Pinnock, who is helping us to identify descendants of those people who were harmed in the 1898 in order to invite their participation as well. And then we have the Wilmington 10 Foundation, which is, of course, an initiative that helps to support scholarships for students who have been impacted by racial injustice in this community. And then, of course, I like to say that we now have the Restorative Justice Collaborative at UNCW, which is very much geared toward producing more racial justice, or at least helping to be an ally in the work toward racial justice in our community, and many others. This is not an exhaustive list. So how are we set for time? I know that people are we got a little bit of a late start, so perhaps we can spend a little bit of time in discussion.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, I actually am interested in everything that you had to say, and I am very proud to know you and be part of our restorative justice collaboration and have UNCW as a partner. And I wanted to acknowledge other partners that have been on this call, specifically the Resiliency Task Force. I see Jay Skiba in there. And I'm been very invested in being on that committee for diversity or for equity and inclusion with the RTF. And we have a lot of initiatives going. So I wanted to circle back to your empirical evidence and that piece on white privilege, where I see it now in voter suppression as being part of the league, and our league mission is to empower voters and to defend democracy. Where I see the biggest need for us, not only in just education, we have an education action team, which I'll be introducing Ann Eidelman, our action team leader, here shortly. But I also want to mention that our fair elections team really needs as much investment and engagement from our current members, and extend an invitation to those on this call and those who'll be listening to our YouTube recording later to please contact us, because we all are hands on deck right now trying to make sure that we work on voter suppression, and that's been one of our main objectives. So we could use all the help we can get. So we welcome you for that. So that's my comment. And the first question that I saw in the chat was from Hugh McManus, and his question was, what is your perspective on the new North Carolina history curriculum with regards to critical race theory?
Yes, thank you for that question, Mr. McManus. First of all, I need to alert everyone, I'm not a curriculum expert. There are many other people at UNCW in the Watson College of Education who are curriculum experts and can do a better job of critiquing the changes that have been made in the social studies curriculum. So what I know about it is what I read in the newspapers about it. And my initial thought is that it seems to be a more accurate, comprehensive social studies curriculum for K-12. But again, I'm not a curriculum expert, and I would be happy to invite others among us, because we do have some curriculum experts in our group today who might be better prepared to offer some insights about the curriculum, particularly as it relates to critical race theory. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Is there a curriculum expert among us who'd like to chime in with a thought on that?
Mary Ellen, you could raise your hand if you want to, and Mary Ellen will unmute you if that's acceptable.
I know we have Dr. Faust from our superintendent from our school district present, and I'm not sure whether we have any other staff who are curriculum experts.
Hello.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. How are you? I'm glad to be invited. Was there a question for me?
Yes, Kim, you want to repeat that?
Sure. So the question was with regard to our views on the new social studies curriculum that was just approved at the state level. I'm just identifying myself. I'm not a curriculum expert. I do critical race theory at the university level. My initial read of the curriculum changes at the state level with respect to social studies is that it seems to be more in line with what critical race theory scholars are trying to accomplish, which is a more comprehensive view of our history and our current social circumstances. And so, but that's just my view. And again, I'm not a curriculum expert.
So So there were very few changes that were actually adopted in there. As most of you know who have actually taken a history class, you didn't start to speak about racism until later, and it probably started with things that happened in 1960 and how much of the information that was given, it was very little. So we're still there. The part that people are having some difficulty is when it's saying, let's have some conversation around it and requiring people to think a little bit more in depth about the conversations. But there's no information there where it's talking about hate. There's no indoctrination of any of the standards that are in there. One of the things that I would also have individuals just to think about is that, so we have hundreds of social studies teachers across the state. I'll even go up to say thousands of social studies and history teachers across the state. How many of those individuals have come to the table and said, we are teaching something that's inappropriate? So we have individuals from the outside who are saying that we are indoctrinating, we're doing these things to kids, but the schools are like, we're teaching what actually the history and the standards state. So it does become, I'll say it's chaotic, it's noise out there to employ something else, but it's not for our kids. So we are not teaching anything with critical that has critical race where they have to go in depth and think of that term. We get to, I think it's around you can do your sophomore, your junior year up there where you have your US history at the high school level. Those conversations are more they delve in a little bit deeper, but it's not to the level of teaching hate. It's still, of course, teaching what happened in the 1800s. It goes up to some of the present. But we're still in search for this indoctrination, this actual theory where it aligns to what was actually just spoken of today. We don't find that. And of course, the state didn't find it. We just have some individuals who continue to make that noise, and it gives some individuals an opportunity to state a case that we can't find.
Thank you, Dr. That was very good. Thank you for clarifying that for us and weighing in. We appreciate that, and we appreciate your time. I'm going to switch over to Ann Eidelman for a second and introduce her, because that way we can switch off my voice and face for a minute. But Ann Eidelman is our action team leader for our education action team, and she does fantastic work with her team, and she's had some difficulty with her computer and technology this morning. But I'm going to let her continue on with reading the next question. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you, Marla, and my apologies. I was supposed to actually introduce Dr. Cook today, and then I vanished off the internet altogether. So, but here I am for as long as the internet permits me. So Dr. Cook, is a little similar. I guess a lot of the concerns from our group have to do with education at the more elementary and high school level rather than the university level. And Leslie Antos has written, does Dr. Cook think that critical race theory has a place in the elementary and high school education curriculums? So do you see critical race theory fitting in at the younger level?
You know, that's a fascinating question. I don't really know how to answer it. I spend a fair amount of time in public schools in a region working on helping to build restorative practices. And what I see is that children are often eager to learn about the history that relates to them and their families. And so if we're putting children of color into consideration as students learning their history, if we don't teach the history that is inclusive of people of color and the history of the United States, then those children are going to have an amputated sense of identity around who they are and where they fit in the world. and where they fit in their communities. And so for students that I see, there's a need for a positive influence, sort of having people who look like them to be positively portrayed in the schools. So people that have had success. I mean, when I grew up in public schools, I learned about dead men who looked like me, some of whom were my ancestors. My ancestors came over in the 1620s in colonial Massachusetts and did what was then considered great things. I didn't learn about the people that they enslaved. I didn't learn about the indigenous people that they slaughtered and enslaved, right? And how they were able to do those great things. And it's, now that I know it, I can't not know that. That's part of our history and part of my family heritage. So I think children at the elementary school age or middle school age really benefit a lot when they have an opportunity to discover the creativity and the innovation and the determination and the strength of people who look like them, which is taken for granted for people who look like me, that we learn those things about our forebears, but we often do not share as much about that for children of color who are also in our charge. I love Judge Corpening, who often says, all of our children are all of our children. And I also want to make the case that children who are white benefit from learning about people from other cultures as well. This is not just to benefit only children of color. This is to benefit all children, to be more inclusive, to be more respectful, to be more conscious of how advantage and disadvantage, privilege and lack of privilege, access to resources and lack of access to resources shapes their schooling, their friendships, their community, their parents' lives. I think it's all very important for everyone to have an education that is inclusive and meaningfully responsive to the children who are in the classroom. Does that help?
It does. Thank you for that. Looking at our time, we're at 12:28, but we're going to go a little bit farther if you don't mind, Kim, just since we got such a late start, because we have quite a few questions stacked up. You can give me a hands up signal or whenever you need me to stop, but I'm going to keep going. Our next question comes from Norma Marty. She says, the classroom teaching is important, but how can we change hearts in life of families, churches, and workplace?
You know, I love the book Just Mercy. If any of you have never read the book Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, I would encourage you to read it. He lays out a path toward promoting justice and promoting stronger communities. And one of the things I've learned from him, both in my professional work with him, as well as within reading the book and being affiliated with some of the work that he's done, is the importance of proximity. We live in a segregated society, an informally de facto segregated society, which is really tragic. And so by experiencing proximity with people who are from different life experiences, increases empathy, it increases understanding, it increases fun, it increases joy, it increases creativity, it increases companionship, right? There's just the proximity. We are hardwired to connect. We are humans. And as humans, one of the things that heals us from the traumas that we've all experienced is connection to other people who can soothe us when we're in pain. And if we expand the circle of influence from those of us who are who can soothe us when we're in pain, to include people who are not like us, then we have a more robust community of concern. We have a more robust community of people who can hold each other together. We have, I mean, think about if Hurricane Florence came back, I mean, God forbid, who are you going to go to for support? Do you have the proximity and the strong community around you to support you through a crisis? Do you have people in your neighborhood? Do you have people in your civic life? Do you have people in your work life who come from different life experiences that teach you more about yourself and teach you more about humanity because of that different life experience? You know, I think it's really vital for us to have proximity with one another. And I realize that that's ironic saying it to a computer screen. But that's the nature of the world. Proximity when it's safe, given COVID issues, right? So proximity in emotional proximity, proximity in social proximity, proximity in terms of civic engagement and the ways in which you spend your volunteer time, whether you're volunteering, as I do as a volunteer board member for Link or Healing Justice. Are you getting close to people who are different from you in significant ways and whose life experiences are different from your own, and can build rapport, can build relationships that are emotionally rewarding and community beneficial, right? So benefiting our whole community. So that proximity piece is really vitally important. It's so much easier to demonize people you don't know. It's so much harder to demonize people that you work with and that you're close to or try to be close to, right? So become proximate with people and hear their stories and listen more than talk. I'm doing way more talking than I normally do. Normally I like to sit back and observe and listen and be part of an audience, but this is not that situation today. I like to listen more than I talk. So I'll stop talking for now and answer the next question that comes up.
All right, so we have a slightly different one.
Yeah.
Person is Jamie Harwood, says, some of those who oppose critical race theory believe it has harmful effects to BIPOC students, that it somehow suppresses their achievements. What are your thoughts?
I think it's one of the final points I made that I put in bold font on the presentation is that strategies can occur without necessarily being connected to facts, right? And I don't see the evidence of that happening. In fact, I would see more of the reverse happening. So I had a student at my university level class who once asked or once commented at the end of the semester when we were talking about, you know, because I teach crime and justice issues, and you know, they're painful subjects. There's like trauma in everyday classes that I'm teaching about trauma all the time. And I'm teaching about trauma that's a consequence of racial inequality, gender inequality, economic inequality, and sexual orientation inequalities as well. And so I had a student, with respect to racial inequality specifically, say to me at the end of a semester one time, because I was talking about mass incarceration, I was talking about the school to prison pipeline. She said, I feel like I've been lied to my whole life. And so by not telling the truth about American history, when students get to the university level, the learning is harder because the comfort of the curriculum at the K-12 level doesn't adequately prepare students for the sometimes very painful truths that are taught at the university level. And that, I think, is indicative of this student's experience when she expressed that point to me, that she felt like she had been lied to her whole life.
I can identify with that feeling, so I get that one. Let me go on to Benita Gale. She says, how do you engage impacted citizens in the leadership of the collaborative? What strategies does the collaborative use to power impacted citizens to advance the movement?
Well, I love that question, and I'm so grateful for having an opportunity to talk about the Restorative Justice Collaborative at UNCW. It's new. It was launched in January, and through the spring semester, because of COVID restrictions, there was limits on how many people we could join together. We did some Zoom meetings, but we didn't have a lot of activity going on. Beginning this fall semester, there will be a lot more activity in the Restorative Justice Collaborative with publicly announced trainings and cultivating more restorative justice leadership in our community. I am doing the best I can to remain active in the schools. And I often invite my students every semester in my restorative justice classes. I invite my students to also work with me on various community initiatives going on in the area that involve building restorative practices. And those students learn so much by being engaged in the community as well as taking the class. And so my students are out there, I'm out there, we're doing the work that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. We often are keeping a lower profile, but beginning in the fall semester, there will be more higher profile opportunities and invitations for people to become engaged. And it'll involve trainings, it'll involve, you know, if there's a nonprofit organization that you're aware of that wants to learn more about restorative justice, I can create a presentation that's specific to the service mission of the nonprofit organization and come in and do a training with you. I'm trying to create, I'm planning on building having a restorative justice summit for the New Hanover County region and have people who are interested in restorative justice or actively engaged in restorative justice to come together to talk about what do we see as the needs in our community. I'm not in a position to unilaterally dictate what the needs are in our community, but I really want to have a summit of people who are actively involved in serving our community to talk to each other, that proximity thing, to talk to each other about what the needs are and what the opportunities are and where we should be maybe spending our time and effort in building more restorative practices.
Thank you. This is a good time for me to plug our upcoming event in October, which you will be partnering with us at UNCW for. It is going to be October 16th. It will be with UNCW and the authors of the book Fragile Democracy. And it will be a symposium held at 2:00 on that Saturday at the Cameron Auditorium, which seats about 300. So if you could save the date for that, it's a free event. Please mark that on your calendars and we will be sending out information pretty soon about that. So definitely want to make sure the audience today and then those watching YouTube later get to make sure they put that on their calendars, because we certainly want to talk about the history of voter suppression and the impact of Jim Crow and slavery into our area and how that's in our groundwater here in North Carolina. So I will say that and hand it back over to Anne.
All right, well, I'm actually jumping down a couple of questions because some of them are a little repetitive in terms of the themes, and you've answered some of the points. This question I thought was interesting. It's from Marlene Barney, and she says, do you think it's helpful to use the term critical race theory at all in the context of what we teach our kids in public schools? Wouldn't we achieve the same goals by just saying, teach complete, accurate, and factual history, which, in her opinion, would be more difficult to politically spin?
I don't know the answer. I don't have an answer for that. My opinion is probably not helpful. I think that the phrase critical race theory emerged from legal scholars as an area as a theoretical framework for examining how institutions reinforce inequality around race. It was dubbed critical race theory by the scholars who started it, right? So they got to name it, and that's cool. It then became a boogeyman of sorts in the current political climate. I don't think the scholars who use critical race theory are going to stop using critical race theory anytime soon, and I don't think that they're going to rename it. I think at the public school level, that debate is better had by people who are at the public school level at the curriculum tables. I think it's become a flashpoint. I think it's become a misunderstood flashpoint, which has muddied the waters rather than clarified the issues, which is, I'm really grateful for a forum like this where we can have a conversation about the truth of it. So I think being clear is helpful, and the language that you used in your question around what to call it, I think is really clear, personally. And I think that might help to cool the debate a little bit, because the debate is pretty hot and wild right now. And when we're making policy decisions, it's better to do it with a cool head rather than a hot head. We generally end up with better policies when we're doing it systematically and thoughtfully and spending time gathering the right information and the data that we need and the issues that we need to address, if we're doing it with a cool head. If we're doing it with a hot head, we're more inclined to demonize, we're more inclined to diminish, we're more inclined to not listen to each other, we're more inclined to cast each other in a role that we don't want to necessarily inhabit. So I think it's important for us to be faithful to the ideas of critical race theory. As a scholar, I try to be. I do think that there is a need for us to be clear at the K-12 level in terms of what we're teaching our kids, and that it needs to be responsive to the students who are in the classroom and accurate history. So I am not unilaterally equipped to make a declaration what it should be called, but I think it's an important conversation to ask the question, how should it be as well?
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask you one last question, but there are several others in the chat. Would you mind if I sent this to you afterwards and so that you have the opportunity to answer those questions, Kim?
Sure, you can send it to me. I'm pretty pressed for time right now, so I'm not going to promise to get back to every single question, but I will do what I can.
Thank you so much. For your last question, which is kind of along the same lines, it's how do you respond to the criticism that critical race theory is Marxist by those who don't understand the history of Marxism as a political economic study of society and sociology and critical studies?
So I read a lot of Marxism when I was in graduate school because I had to as part of my curriculum as a sociologist. I mean, one of the foundational concepts within sociology is the concept of social inequality. And you can't really understand economic inequality without reading Marx. You just can't. And you certainly can't understand the genesis of economic inequality in a post-industrial society in a modern, cosmopolitan way without understanding Marx. And so while I have read and understood Marx and Marxism, and there are many insights from Marx and Marxism that I think are valuable for all of us to be able to digest and understand and use. I know that the frame of social inequality, particularly around race, is what captures the imagination of a lot of people who are attracted to critical race theory. it is a feature. I mean, Marx is about examining how social inequality, economic inequality develops, and with an eye toward trying to reduce the harms of economic inequality. So if you're talking about economic inequality, you have to go back to using Marx as an analytical lens, as a starting point, but not an ending point. And what I tell my students when we're talking about Marxist theory is that I'm not trying to make you a Marxist, I'm trying to make you an educated person. And my job is to teach you the ideas that drive our society and the ideas that have shaped how we live, right, as a sociologist. And so as an educated person, you need to understand the foundations of thought that drive the social change that we all experience. Whether we like it or not, we experience social change. And so as an educated person, you need to understand that Marx is one of the leading thinkers in how our world has been shaped, not just our country, but how our world has been shaped, right? Agree with it or disagree with it is up to you. I don't care what you think of it in terms of your political opinions, but I do care that you know about it. So I think it's important to know about it. General Miley said something similar, that, you know, he reads widely because he needs to know about different ideas and multiple ideas. So it's important. If you discard it, that's fine, but understand what you're discarding before you discard it, right? And so critical race theory is similar in that. Understand it. If you've never read critical race theory, pick up a book. There's lots of them out there. There's a lot of good material out there that come from critical race theory. We could do a critical race theory reading group. I mean, I don't know that I have time to devote to that, but there could be a critical race theory reading group. We do have the Race Matters reading group here in Wilmington, led by Jim Downey, which is wonderful. They do a lot of great books on race matters, which is why it's called the Race Matters Book Group. So if you want any more information about that, you can contact Jim or me. There's a Facebook group, the Race Matters Facebook group as well.
Fantastic. Actually, Kim, you've been a wealth of information. I want to say that if you want to hear more from Kim Cook through the League, I will tell you that on September 15th, she will be back. She will be our presenter for the 1898 Wilmington coup d'etat statewide webinar that will be going out to all the leagues. And of course, anybody in the general public will be welcome to that and to attend. So she will be back because she is a fountain of information and a great partner to us. So I thank you for your time. And for our audience today, we've had so many thoughtful questions. We appreciate your contributions to that and for attending. I do want to mention that our fair election team is really gearing up and rebooting. So August 18th at the main library here in Wilmington, there will be a fair elections meeting, and all are welcome to attend. So I do believe that Sue Marsh, our vice president, put that information in the chat. So please write that down and keep that handy. If you would like to learn more about the League, as I said, we're a 501c3 organization, a nonprofit. We certainly welcome your contributions and your membership. We have lots of things for you to be involved in. So I put the information up here on this last slide so that you can find us. We would love to hear from you, and please engage with us this year. We're all in the fight for lives and fight for justice. So if you would like to join in, we certainly would love to have you. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here.
Always. All done, Mary Ellen.